Good evening. Tonight, we'll travel back in time, one calm step at a time. Tonight, we're going on a gentle journey, not through space, but through centuries. We'll step into the flickering candlelight of a medieval castle, where tapestries hang heavy on stone walls, fire crackles in the hearth, and laughter echoes through vaulted halls. But behind all that grandeur, behind the music and the feasting, is a story that rarely gets told. A story about someone whose job was to make others laugh, while quietly carrying his own sorrow. Have you ever smiled when you didn't feel like it? Ever laughed just to keep things light, even when your heart felt heavy? Well, tonight, we meet a man who lived that truth every single day. His name was Thomas, and he was a court jester. Now, jesters often appear in stories as silly figures, clowns with bells and painted faces, dancing at banquets and making kings chuckle over goblets of wine. But what if I told you that being a jester wasn't always fun and games? What if I told you that sometimes, the loudest laughter hides the quietest sadness? So, are you ready? Then let's begin our journey together, back to a time when laughter was both a gift and a burden. Before we dive in, if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, if these words bring you even a little peace, then please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a small comment if you feel comfortable. Just a simple "I'm here in your city, and it's your local time" would mean the world to me. It reminds us all that we're sharing this quiet moment together, no matter where we are in the world. And now, if you can, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. Lower the brightness on your screen, close your eyes, and let the day gently fall away. There's nothing urgent here. No rush, no pressure. Just a story, told softly, for a tired soul like yours. Let's begin. Part 1, Day 1 in the Castle, Stepping into a New World. The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling hills of the English countryside, casting golden light across fields still damp with dew. In the distance, a rooster crowed, and somewhere nearby, the soft clatter of wooden buckets against stone echoed through the quiet village. It was on a morning like this that Thomas stood at the edge of his old world, staring toward the horizon where the great castle loomed, gray, immense, and silent as a mountain. He was just 13 years old, barefoot, and dressed in clothes that had once belonged to someone taller, someone older. His mother had stitched patches into the knees and sleeves the night before, her fingers moving quickly by candlelight while he sat quietly on a low stool beside her. She hadn't said much, only that this was an opportunity, one not many boys from their village ever got. And though she smiled as she tied the small bundle of belongings behind his back, her eyes were tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work alone. Thomas didn't know what to feel. Excitement? Fear? A strange mix of both, perhaps. The messenger who came the day before had spoken in grand words, a place among lords, a chance to serve the court, a life far from dust and hunger. But Thomas wasn't sure what any of that meant. He had never seen a castle up close, never eaten anything finer than coarse bread and goat cheese, never worn shoes that fit properly. All he knew was that today, he would step into a world unlike anything he had ever known. As he walked along the dirt path leading away from the village, the familiar sounds of home faded behind him, the creak of the old well wheel, the laughter of children playing near the stream, the scent of wood smoke curling from chimneys. In their place came new sensations, the distant clang of metal on metal, the steady rhythm of hooves on stone, the occasional shout of a rider passing by. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, not because of the bag on his back, but because of the weight of all the unknown things ahead. By midday, The road had widened into a proper lane, lined with carts and travelers heading in the same direction. Some were merchants carrying bolts of fabric or baskets of fruit, others were servants returning to the castle after running errands in the villages below. Thomas kept his head down, trying not to stare too long at anyone's face, afraid that if he looked curious, he might seem out of place. He was already different enough, smaller, quieter, and without a horse beneath him. It was late afternoon when he finally saw it, the castle gates rising high above him, flanked by 2 watchtowers where guards stood with spears resting casually against their shoulders. The stones were darkened with age, and ivy crept along the edges like nature itself was trying to soften the fortress's sharp lines. As he passed through the gates, the world changed again. The air smelled different here, cleaner, mixed with the faint scent of beeswax candles and roasted meat. There was music somewhere in the distance, soft and slow, played on a lute or something similar. People moved with purpose, their clothing rich with color and detail, their voices calm but firm. Thomas barely had time to take it all in before a man in a dark blue tunic approached him. "You must be the new one," he said, looking down at Thomas with a neutral expression. "Come with me." That was how it began. No questions, no introductions. Just a nod and a gesture, and suddenly, Thomas was being led deeper into the castle, past archways carved with stories he couldn't read, past corridors lit by sconces that flickered gently in the breeze. The floor beneath his feet was made of polished stone, cool even through the thin soles of his boots. Every step echoed softly, like whispers chasing each other through the halls. They stopped outside a heavy wooden door. The man turned to him. "This is your first lesson," he said. "Listen more than you speak. Watch more than you move. Learn quickly, or you'll find yourself sent back before the week is out." Then he opened the door, and Thomas stepped inside. Inside was a room unlike anything he had ever seen. The ceiling stretched high above, supported by thick wooden beams carved with twisting patterns. Windows let in pale light, filtered through stained glass that painted the floor with colors he didn't have names for. There were shelves filled with books, tables covered in scrolls, and in the center of it all, a man in a red robe sat behind a large desk, writing with careful strokes of a quill. Without looking up, the man spoke. "So this is the boy from the village?" "Yes, Master Alric," the man beside Thomas replied. Master Alric finally lifted his gaze, studying Thomas with sharp, intelligent eyes. Then he nodded once. "Bring him tomorrow morning. We begin training at dawn." And just like that, Thomas's new life had begun. In the days that followed, he learned many things: how to bow correctly, how to walk silently on wooden floors, how to keep his voice low unless asked to speak. He was taught to juggle small wooden balls, to balance plates on sticks, to twist his face into exaggerated expressions that would make people laugh. He practiced until his arms ached, until his legs trembled from standing too long, until his throat was sore from repeating jokes over and over again. But beyond the lessons, there was something else, the feeling of being watched, always. Not in a cruel way, but in the way one watches a bird learning to fly, uncertain if it will fall. He could feel the eyes of the other servants, the noblemen, even the guards, all wondering if he would last, if he would become useful, if he would earn his place. At night, when the castle grew quiet and only the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the halls, Thomas would sit alone in the small chamber he had been given. It was nothing fancy, just a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a single window that looked out over the courtyard. He would press his forehead against the cold glass and look out at the moonlit sky, breathing in the cool night air. Sometimes he thought about home, the smell of hay in the barn, the warmth of his mother's hand on his shoulder, the simple joy of running barefoot through the grass. Sometimes he wondered if they missed him, if they talked about him, if they hoped he was happy. And sometimes he simply closed his eyes and listened to the silence. Because in this castle, silence was rare. There were nights when laughter rang through the halls, loud and sudden, bouncing off the stone walls like thunder. Other nights brought the soft hum of conversation, the clink of goblets, the shuffle of feet dancing in the great hall. And then there were the nights when everything fell still, when even the wind seemed to pause outside the windows, and the only sound was the beating of his own heart. Those were the nights when Thomas felt most alone. But loneliness was a luxury he couldn't afford for long. Morning always came, bringing with it another round of lessons, another set of expectations, another reminder that he was here to entertain, not to dream. Still, he held on to those quiet moments, the ones where the world seemed to forget him, where he could simply be a boy again, standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. And in those moments, he dared to hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this life wouldn't be so bad. Hope that he would find a place here, even if it was small. Hope that one day, he would make someone laugh, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And in the meantime, he listened. He watched. He waited. And he tried to remember who he was, even as the castle slowly tried to change him. The first time Thomas saw another jester was on the third morning after his arrival. He had been walking through a narrow corridor, one that smelled faintly of damp stone and old parchment, when he heard laughter ahead. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from nobles or servants. This was different. It was light, exaggerated, almost theatrical. Curious, he followed the sound until he reached an open doorway. Inside, he saw a man standing in the middle of a small room, dressed in a patchwork tunic of bright red and yellow. His hat had bells stitched into it, and with every movement, they chimed softly. The man's face was painted, white cheeks, darkened eyebrows, and a wide red mouth that stretched like a crescent moon. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway as the man jibbled 3 wooden apples while making strange faces at a group of young pages who were sitting cross-legged on the floor. Every time he dropped a piece of fruit, he gasped dramatically, placing a hand over his heart as if the world had just ended. And each time he caught them again, he threw his arms up in triumph, shouting, "Behold! I am magic!" The boys laughed loudly, clapping their hands, and even Thomas felt the corners of his lips twitch upward. But before he could step back unnoticed, the jester turned and saw him. For a moment, there was silence. Then the man smiled, not the exaggerated smile he had used for the children, but something softer, more knowing. "Well now," he said, lowering the apples to his side. "A new face." The boys turned to look, and Thomas suddenly felt very small. He gave a quick bow, unsure of what else to do. The jester tilted his head. "Come in, come in. Don't be shy. You're here to learn, aren't you?" Thomas hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The air was warm, filled with the scent of beeswax candles and roasted chestnuts. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the walls where tapestries hung, scenes of knights and dragons, of feasts and battles. "I'm called Roderick," the jester said, offering a sweeping bow that made the bells on his hat ring out like tiny chimes. "And you are?" "Thomas," he answered quietly. Roderick grinned. "Well then, Thomas, welcome to the Court of Laughter." That day, Thomas sat with Roderick in the pages for the first time. He didn't speak much, mostly watched as Roderick demonstrated how to make people laugh without saying a word. He learned that a raised eyebrow could be funnier than a punchline, that a well-timed pause could build suspense better than any drum roll, that sometimes all it took was a single expression to turn a quiet room into a chorus of giggles. When the session ended and the pages ran off to their next lesson, Roderick leaned down toward Thomas and whispered, "You'll get the hang of it soon enough. Just remember, don't let them see you trying too hard. Let the laughter come to you." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood completely. He wanted to believe that laughter could come naturally, that joy could find its way into his chest without effort. But deep down, he wondered if it would always feel like work. Over the following weeks, Thomas slowly became part of the castle's rhythm. He learned the names of the other servants, Marjorie, who worked in the kitchens and always slipped him extra bread, Elias, who polished silverware so carefully it looked like he was handling treasure, and Lila, a girl his age who helped care for the horses and sometimes waved at him when no one was watching. He also learned about the rules, unspoken ones that weren't written down but passed from one servant to another in hushed voices. Like how to walk silently across the great hall during a meal, how to disappear into the background when a noble entered a room, how to keep your eyes lowered unless directly addressed. But most importantly, he learned how to wear a mask, not the kind made of paint and cloth, but the kind that lived behind his eyes, hiding everything he truly felt. There were moments, of course, when he forgot. When he laughed because something genuinely amused him, or when he frowned without meaning to. And those were the moments when someone would remind him, gently, but firmly, that a jester's job was not to feel, but to reflect. One evening, after a long day of practice, Thomas wandered outside to the courtyard. The sky had turned a deep shade of violet, and the stars were beginning to appear like tiny pinpricks in a vast canvas of darkness. He found a quiet corner near the stables and sat down on a stone bench, letting the cool night air settle around him. For a while, he simply listened. The distant murmur of voices from the great hall. The soft whinny of a horse. The occasional creak of wood settling under its own weight. Then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and turned to see Roderick approaching, holding 2 small cups in his hands. "You looked like you needed this," Roderick said, handing one of the cups to Thomas. Thomas took it carefully. The liquid inside smelled faintly of honey and spice. "It's warmed mead," Roderick explained. "Not too strong. Just enough to take the edge off a long day." Thomas took a small sip. It was sweet, soothing, and strangely comforting. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their drinks and watching the night unfold above them. After a moment, Roderick spoke. "Do you miss home?" Thomas blinked, surprised by the question. He thought about the fields, the barn, the smell of hay and earth. He thought about his mother's voice calling him in for supper, about the way the wind felt against his skin when he ran barefoot through the grass. "Yes," he admitted quietly. Roderick nodded. "It fades, eventually. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just hides in places you don't expect." Thomas looked at him. "Have you ever left the castle?" Roderick chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Once or twice. Not often. Once you become part of the court, it's hard to imagine life beyond these walls." Thomas didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure he wanted to leave, not yet. But he also wasn't sure he wanted to stay forever. Roderick seemed to sense his thoughts. "Being a jester is like being a shadow," he said after a while. "We're seen, but never really noticed. We speak truths in jest, and we cry in silence. But we're still here. Still watching. Still listening. Thomas stared into his cup. Is that why you always laugh? Roderick looked at him for a long time before answering. Sometimes. Other times, I just forget how not to. They stayed outside a little longer, letting the silence wrap around them like a blanket. Eventually, Roderick finished his drink and stood up. You should go back inside, he said. It gets cold out here, and tomorrow will come whether you're ready for it or not. Thomas nodded and stood as well. As he walked back toward the castle, he glanced once more at the sky. The stars were brighter now, scattered across the heavens like drops of silver ink. He thought about Roderick's words, about shadows, about laughter, about silence. And he wondered if, someday, he would forget how not to smile. Part 2. Inside the Jester's room, the quiet hours of a fool. As Thomas settled into life at the castle, he began to understand that behind every grand hall and echoing corridor was a world of quiet corners, places where laughter faded, and silence took its place. One such place became his own small room, tucked away in a quieter wing of the castle, far from the bustling kitchens and the lively great hall. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a wooden stool beside it, and a single window that looked out over a courtyard where servants came and went like shadows beneath stone walls. But for Thomas, it was everything. It was the only space in the castle where he could be truly alone, where no one expected him to smile or speak or perform. And in those quiet hours after long days of practice, he would sit by the window and simply watch the world move without him. The room smelled faintly of beeswax and damp wood, a scent that seemed to linger no matter how often he opened the window. A small oil lamp sat on a shelf beside his few belongings, a comb with broken teeth, a small mirror cracked along one edge, and a worn piece of cloth that had once been part of his mother's apron. She had sewn it into the lining of his tunic before he left home, saying it would remind him of where he came from. And sometimes, when he ran his fingers over the soft fabric, he could almost hear her voice again. At night, when the castle grew still and even the wind seemed to pause outside his window, Thomas would lie awake and listen. He listened to the distant creak of wooden beams settling under their own weight, to the occasional footstep of a guard making his rounds, to the soft hum of candlelight flickering in unseen corridors. And in those moments, he felt something strange, not loneliness exactly, but a kind of peace that came from knowing he was unseen, untouched by expectation. He had learned quickly that being watched was a constant part of life here. In the great hall, during meals or performances, all eyes turned toward the center of attention, whether it was a noble speaking, a minstrel playing, or a jester making people laugh. But in his little room, there were no eyes upon him. No need to pretend. No need to perform. Just the steady rhythm of his own breath and the quiet comfort of 4 stone walls that held no secrets but his own. One evening, as he sat by the window watching the last light of day fade into deep blue, he heard a soft knock at the door. It startled him at first. Visitors were rare in this part of the castle, especially so late. He hesitated before calling out, "Come in." The door creaked open slowly, and Roderick stepped inside, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He gave Thomas a quiet smile and said, "I thought you might need this." Thomas sat up straighter as Roderick walked over and placed the bundle on the stool beside the bed. With careful hands, Thomas unwrapped it to find a pair of soft leather boots, worn but well-kept, and a small pouch filled with dried figs and honey candies. "They belong to another boy," Roderick explained, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "He didn't stay long." "Not everyone does." Thomas looked at the boots, then back at Roderick. Why are you giving them to me? Roderick shrugged. Because I remember what it was like to arrive here with nothing but a bag of borrowed clothes and a head full of questions. And because sometimes, kindness is the only thing that keeps us going. Thomas ran his fingers over the smooth leather of the boots, feeling the warmth they had absorbed from someone else's feet. He wasn't sure what to say, so he simply nodded. Roderick stood and stretched his arms above his head. Get some rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway and glanced back. And Thomas, don't forget to take off your mask now and then. Even jesters need to breathe. Then he was gone, leaving Thomas alone once more with only the sound of his own thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Thomas found himself retreating to his room more often. It became a refuge, a place where he could sit quietly and let the noise of the castle fade into the background. He would light a small candle and watch the flame dance in the glass holder, imagining stories in the way the shadows moved across the walls. Sometimes he imagined himself back home, walking barefoot through the fields, helping his father mend fences, listening to his mother sing as she worked around the house. Other times, he imagined what his life might have been if he hadn't come to the castle, if he had stayed in the village, grown up like the other boys, married someone simple and kind, and lived a life that was ordinary, but peaceful. But those thoughts always faded when the morning came. Because in the daylight, he had work to do. Each day brought new lessons, new ways to twist his face into exaggerated expressions, new tricks to keep an audience entertained, new songs to sing while juggling wooden balls in perfect rhythm. He practiced until his fingers ached, until his throat felt raw from repeating lines over and over again. He learned how to fall gracefully, how to land softly on the floor without hurting himself, how to make pain look funny instead of real. But beyond the physical training, there was something else he was learning, something less obvious, harder to name. It was the way people looked at him when he performed, not with love, not with friendship, but with amusement. They laughed at him, not with him. And though he smiled through it all, he could feel the distance growing between himself and the rest of the world. There were nights when he would sit in his room and stare at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He barely recognized himself anymore. His face had changed, not in shape or size, but in expression. The boy who had arrived at the castle with wide eyes and hopeful dreams seemed like a stranger now. In his place was someone who knew how to bow deeply, how to speak in riddles, how to turn sorrow into something entertaining. One evening, as he traced the edge of the mirror with his fingertip, he wondered if this was what it meant to grow up, to learn how to hide the things that hurt, to wear a smile even when it didn't belong to you. Outside, the wind whispered against the window pane, carrying with it the scent of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, the signal for servants to begin preparing for the evening meal. Soon, the halls would fill with voices, laughter, the clinking of goblets. And Thomas would be expected to play his part. But for just a little longer, he allowed himself to sit in the quiet. For just a little longer, he let himself remember who he was before the castle changed him. Thomas had learned to measure time not by the sun or the ringing of bells, but by the rhythm of laughter, when it came, how long it lasted, and who was making it. In the great hall, laughter was like music, rising and falling in waves, sometimes soft and polite, other times loud and unrestrained. And Thomas, like a conductor, knew exactly when to step forward, when to bow deeply, and when to twist his face into something ridiculous enough to make even the most serious nobleman chuckle. But there were days when laughter felt heavier than usual, when the weight of pretending became too much, and he found himself retreating to his small room before anyone noticed. It was on one such evening that he sat by the window, wrapped in the quiet comfort of dusk, watching as torches flickered to life along the castle walls. The sky above was painted in deep purples and blues, and the stars were beginning to appear like tiny pinpricks in a vast canvas of darkness. He had just closed his eyes, letting the cool night air settle around him, when he heard a knock at the door, light, almost hesitant. "Come in," he said softly. The door creaked open, and Marjorie stepped inside, carrying a tray with 2 small bowls of warm stew. She smiled when she saw him and set the tray down on the stool beside his bed. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You didn't come to the kitchens tonight." Thomas gave her a tired smile. "I wasn't sure I wanted to eat." Marjorie tilted her head slightly, studying him with kind eyes. "You look tired after dinner. Like your feet were still dancing long after the music stopped." He chuckled lightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe they were." She sat down beside him on the edge of the bed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You know, you don't have to carry everything alone, right?" Thomas looked at her for a moment, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. He had always liked Marjorie. She was one of the few people in the castle who spoke to him like a real person rather than a performer. When she brought him extra bread or whispered a joke when no one else was listening, it reminded him that he was more than just a jester in a colorful tunic. "I know," he said quietly. "It's just hard sometimes." She nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. Being watched all the time can wear on a person. You're always expected to be entertaining, to be funny, to be someone else. But you don't have to be that for me. Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling some of the tension in his chest loosen. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "That means more than I can say." They sat in silence for a while, eating their stew in slow, quiet bites. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees beyond the courtyard, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before settling back into silence. When they finished, Marjorie gathered the empty bowls and stood up. "Try to get some rest," she said gently. "And remember, you don't always have to wear a mask." Thomas watched as she walked toward the door, pausing only briefly before stepping out into the hallway. Then, just as she was about to close the door behind her, she turned back and added, "Even fools need friends." And then she was gone, leaving Thomas alone once more with the quiet hum of candlelight and the steady rhythm of his own breath. He lay back against the thin pillow, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced across the wooden beams. For the first time in a long while, he felt something shift, not a grand change, not an epiphany, but a small, quiet realization. He wasn't entirely alone here. There were people who saw him, truly saw him, even if only for a moment. People who cared, even if they never said it aloud. And maybe that was enough, for now. As sleep began to pull at the edges of his mind, he thought about Roderick's words again, about masks, about laughter, about silence. He wondered how many others in the castle wore masks of their own. Did the cooks pretend not to be tired? Did the guards hide their fears behind stern expressions? Did the noblemen laugh louder than they felt just to keep up appearances? Perhaps everyone in the castle was playing a role in some way. Perhaps being human meant learning how to wear different faces depending on who was watching. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was nothing wrong with that, as long as there was still a part of you that remained untouched, hidden away in a quiet room behind a wooden door. The next morning arrived with the usual sounds, the distant clang of metal, the soft shuffle of servants moving through the halls, the scent of fresh bread drifting in from the kitchens. Thomas dressed slowly, slipping on the boots Roderick had given him, feeling the familiar weight settle over his shoulders as he prepared to step back into the world of laughter and performance. But before he left his room, he paused at the mirror. He studied his reflection, the boy who had arrived at the castle months ago, wide-eyed and uncertain, and the young man who now stood before him, wearing a carefully practiced expression. For a moment, he let the mask slip, just slightly. Just enough to see the real Thomas behind the painted smile. Then he took a deep breath, adjusted his tunic, and stepped out into the hallway. Because today, like every day, would bring new laughter. New masks. And maybe, just maybe, another quiet moment where he could remember who he really was. Part 3, The Laughter That Hides Pain. Thomas had learned to laugh on command, to tilt his head just so, widen his eyes in exaggerated surprise, and let out a high-pitched giggle that always made the nobles chuckle in return. He could summon laughter like a spell, weaving it into the air with nothing more than a well-timed stumble or a clever twist of words. And yet, there were days when the sound felt foreign in his own ears, when the laughter he created for others didn't belong to him at all. One such evening arrived with the scent of roasted pheasant and warm spiced wine drifting through the great hall. The long wooden tables were lined with noblemen and women dressed in fine silks, their laughter rising above the soft music played by minstrels tucked into a corner near the hearth. Candles flickered in heavy iron chandeliers, casting golden light across polished stone floors where servants moved quietly between guests, refilling goblets and offering fresh bread. Thomas stood at the edge of the room, waiting for his cue. His tunic was freshly brushed, the bells on his hat tied securely in place. He had practiced his routine earlier that day, perfecting each step, each expression, each pause meant to build anticipation before the punchline. And yet, as he watched the nobles enjoy their meal, he felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. It wasn't sadness exactly, not the kind that came from missing home or longing for something lost. It was something quieter, more persistent. A feeling that no matter how loudly they laughed, how brightly they smiled, none of them truly saw him. To them, he was a momentary distraction, a flicker of entertainment in an otherwise predictable evening. And once the laughter faded, he would disappear back into the shadows, unseen once more. A voice broke through his thoughts, Roderick's. "You're up next," he whispered, nudging Thomas lightly on the shoulder. "Try not to look so serious. People come here to forget their troubles, not be reminded of them." Thomas forced a smile and stepped forward. With a flourish, he bowed deeply, letting the bells on his hat ring out like tiny chimes. The nobles turned toward him, their faces already lit with expectation. He began with a simple juggling trick, tossing 3 small wooden balls into the air with exaggerated flair. The audience clapped politely. Then he added a bit of movement, a hop, a spin, a pretend stumble that sent one of the balls rolling toward a nobleman's feet. The man picked it up with a grin and tossed it back, earning a round of laughter. Next came the expressions, wide-eyed confusion, mock horror, sudden delight. Each one carefully crafted to draw out another ripple of amusement. He told a short story about a chicken who thought she was a queen, mimicking her strut with exaggerated pride, making his voice high and silly to match. The nobles laughed again, some even wiping tears from their eyes. But as Thomas performed, he felt the distance growing, between himself and the people watching him, between the laughter he created and the silence inside him. He could see it in their eyes, they weren't laughing with him. They were laughing at him. And though he knew this was part of the job, it still stung in a way he couldn't explain. After what felt like an eternity, the performance ended. The nobles gave a polite round of applause, some tossing a few coins onto the floor near his feet. Thomas bowed again, then stepped back into the shadows, letting the minstrels take over with a lively tune that filled the hall with new energy. He slipped away unnoticed, as he often did after a performance. The corridors beyond the great hall were dimly lit, the air cooler now that the warmth of the fire no longer reached this far. He walked slowly, letting his body relax now that the mask could slip, if only slightly. As he passed through the hallway, he heard a familiar voice call his name. Thomas. He turned to see Marjorie standing near the kitchen entrance, holding a small bowl in her hands. She offered it to him with a knowing smile. "I thought you might need something sweet," she said gently. He took the bowl and looked inside, a small serving of honeyed apples, softened by heat and sprinkled with cinnamon. He smiled faintly. "You always know when I'm not quite myself." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I think everyone feels like that sometimes. Like they're pretending to be someone else just to fit in." Thomas nodded, taking a bite of the apple. The sweetness helped soothe the quiet ache in his chest. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "They laugh, they clap, they toss me a few coins, but they never really see me." Marjorie sat down beside him on a low wooden bench, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe they don't know how to see anyone outside their world. Maybe they've forgotten that we have feelings, too." Thomas looked at her. "Do you ever feel like that? Like you're invisible?" She was quiet for a moment before answering. "Sometimes. When I serve food and no one says thank you. When I pass through the halls and no one notices me at all. But I remind myself that I exist beyond their gaze. That my worth isn't measured by whether or not they see me." Thomas considered her words. There was truth in them, a quiet kind of strength that came from knowing you mattered, even if no one else acknowledged it. He finished the last bite of apple and handed the empty bowl back to her. "Thank you," he said softly. "For seeing me." She smiled. "Always." With that, she stood and disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving Thomas alone once more in the quiet corridor. He leaned against the cool stone wall, closing his eyes for a moment as he listened to the distant hum of voices from the great hall. Tonight, like every night, laughter would rise and fall like waves upon the shore. And tomorrow, he would do it all again. But in the spaces between performances, in the quiet corners of the castle where no one was watching, Thomas would remember that behind the painted face and the ringing bells, there was still a boy who longed to be seen. Still a boy who simply wanted to belong. There were nights when Thomas wondered if laughter was a kind of armor, something that protected him from the world, even as it made him more visible. He had learned to wear it like a second skin, letting it shield him from the stares, the whispers, the quiet judgment that followed him through the castle halls. But there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when the armor cracked, and he could feel the weight of everything pressing against his chest. One such moment came on a night when the moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light across the stone courtyard below. The great hall had emptied hours ago, its guests long gone to their chambers, its candles burned down to stubs. The air outside was cool, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. And Thomas, unable to sleep, found himself drawn to the quiet stillness beyond the castle walls. He walked slowly, careful not to make too much noise, knowing that servants were expected to be seen only when necessary. His boots made soft contact with the stone path, and the bells on his hat were silent now, tucked away for the night. As he passed beneath an archway leading into the outer gardens, he noticed a figure seated on a wooden bench near the edge of a small fountain. It was Roderick. Thomas hesitated only briefly before stepping forward. "Can't sleep either?" he asked quietly. Roderick looked up, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Not tonight," he said, patting the space beside him. "Come sit." Thomas did, lowering himself onto the bench with a quiet sigh. The fountain trickled softly behind them, the sound blending with the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night. Then Roderick spoke. "You look tired tonight." Thomas glanced at him. "Was it obvious?" "To me, yes," Roderick admitted. "I've been where you are. I remember what it feels like to smile when your heart is heavy." Thomas looked down at his hands. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "I know how to make people laugh. I know how to twist my face into something silly, how to make them forget their troubles. But sometimes, I don't know how to do that for myself." Roderick nodded slowly. "Laughter is a gift, but it can also be a burden. When you're expected to bring joy to others, it's easy to forget that you need it too." Thomas exhaled, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders loosen. "Do you ever miss being serious?" Roderick chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Sometimes. There are days when I wish I could walk into a room without anyone expecting a joke, a dance, or a clever remark. Just be who I am, without having to perform." Thomas thought about that. About what it would feel like to simply be, without needing to entertain, without needing to prove his worth through laughter. "I used to think this life would be exciting," he admitted. "Being part of the court, wearing bright clothes, hearing people laugh because of me. But sometimes," he trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Sometimes it just feels lonely," Roderick finished for him. Thomas nodded. Roderick leaned back against the bench, staring up at the sky. "I used to think the same thing. When I first arrived here, I believed that laughter meant acceptance. That if people laughed at me, they liked me. But over time, I realized something: laughter doesn't always mean love. Sometimes, it means distance." Thomas frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Roderick turned to look at him. "When someone laughs at you, they're reminded that you're different. That you exist to amuse them, not to be one of them. And once the laughter fades, so does their attention." Thomas let that sink in. He had never thought of it that way before, that laughter, especially when directed at him, could be a form of separation rather than connection. "I guess I never considered that," he said quietly. Roderick gave him a small smile. "Most people don't. It takes time to understand." They fell silent again, the only sounds around them the gentle trickle of water and the distant hum of the castle settling into sleep. After a while, Thomas asked, "Did you ever want to leave?" Roderick was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Yes. Many times. But I stayed because I didn't know where else I belonged." Thomas looked at him. "And now?" Roderick shrugged. "Now, I stay because I choose to. Not because I have to, but because I've found something here, not in the nobles or the performances, but in the people who see me for who I really am. People like you." Thomas felt something shift inside him, not a grand realization, but a quiet warmth, like the last embers of a fire refusing to go out. He smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said, "for talking to me like this." Roderick nudged him lightly with his elbow. "That's what friends are for. They sat together for a little longer, watching the stars move slowly across the sky. Then, one by one, the lights in the castle windows began to fade, signaling that another day was ending. Eventually, Roderick stood. "Come on. We should get some rest. Tomorrow will come whether we're ready or not." Thomas nodded and rose with him. As they walked back toward the castle entrance, he felt lighter somehow, not entirely free of the weight he carried, but less alone beneath it. Because tonight, someone had seen him. Not just the jester, not just the fool who made people laugh. But Thomas. The boy who still remembered how to dream. Part 4, The Loneliest Night of the Week. There was one night each week when the castle felt different, quieter, heavier, as if even the walls themselves were holding their breath. It was the night after a grand feast, when the great hall stood empty and the scent of roasted meat had faded into something more distant, like a memory that refused to stay sharp. The nobles had retired early, the servants moved with slow steps, and the usual hum of conversation had been replaced by silence so thick it seemed to settle in every corner. For Thomas, this night always came with a strange kind of stillness, not peaceful exactly, but deep, like the quiet between heartbeats. He had come to recognize it, to expect it, even if he never quite knew how to feel it. As he walked through the dimly lit corridors, his boots made soft contact with the stone floor, echoing slightly in the emptiness around him. He passed under sconces where candles flickered low, casting long shadows that danced along the walls like ghosts whispering secrets only they could understand. There were no voices tonight, no laughter from the kitchens, no footsteps hurrying toward some unseen task. Just the steady rhythm of his own breath and the occasional creak of wood settling beneath its own weight. He reached his room and pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside as if afraid to disturb whatever silence already lived there. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and cold stone, and the small oil lamp beside his bed cast a warm glow across the familiar objects that surrounded him, the cracked mirror, the worn piece of cloth sewn into his tunic, the small wooden box where he kept the few personal things he owned. Tonight, there was no need to pretend. No audience waiting beyond the curtain, no eyes watching for the perfect expression, no expectation that he should smile on command. And yet, as he sat down on the edge of his narrow bed, he found himself reaching for that mask anyway, not the painted one, not the bells on his hat, but the invisible one that told the world he was fine, that he was content, that he didn't feel the loneliness pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Outside, the wind whispered against the window pane, carrying with it the scent of rain and damp earth. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once before falling silent again. The sky above was dark, save for a few scattered stars that blinked like tired eyes refusing to close. Thomas leaned back against the cool stone wall, letting his head rest against it as he stared up at the ceiling where shadows played across the wooden beams. He thought about home, not just the place, but the feeling. The warmth of the sun on his skin as he ran barefoot through the fields. The sound of his mother's voice calling him in for supper. The way his father used to laugh, deep and full, when Thomas tried to help with chores he barely understood. He wondered if they missed him. He wondered if they talked about him. He wondered if they ever thought about the boy who left one morning with nothing but a small bundle of belongings and a promise that he would find a better life. Sometimes, he imagined writing to them, telling them what it was like here, how he had learned to juggle, how he could make people laugh with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a silly walk. But then he remembered the truth. Letters were rare in this world, and messages from the castle rarely made it to the village below. And besides, how could he explain the parts that mattered most? How could he tell them that laughter wasn't always joy? That sometimes, it was simply survival? That behind every performance, there was a moment when he forgot who he really was. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, letting the thoughts drift away like leaves caught in an autumn breeze. Tonight was not for thinking too much. Tonight was for resting, for listening, for remembering that he existed beyond the expectations of others. But even as he tried to let go, the silence pressed closer. It was strange, he realized, how loud silence could be when you were truly alone. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything else, memories, questions, doubts, dreams. They filled the space left behind when laughter faded, when footsteps disappeared, when the world turned its back for just a little while. And in those moments, Thomas felt the weight of something he couldn't name. Not sadness. Not fear. Something deeper. A longing. To be seen. To be known. To be more than just a fool in a colorful tunic. He reached for the small wooden box beside his bed and opened it carefully. Inside lay a folded piece of parchment, creased from being read too many times. He pulled it out and unfolded it slowly, smoothing the edges with his fingertips. It was a letter, or rather, the start of one. He had begun writing it months ago, unsure of whether he would ever send it. It started simply, "Dear Mother." But beyond that, the words had never come easily. He traced the inked lines with his eyes, rereading the few sentences he had managed to write before giving up. "I hope this finds you well. Life here is different from what I expected. There is laughter every day, and music, and stories that make people forget their troubles. I have learned many things, how to dance, how to juggle, how to make people smile even when my own heart feels heavy." He stopped there, unable to continue. Because how could he finish it? How could he explain that sometimes the loudest laughter hid the quietest sorrow? How could he tell her that he missed her more than he could say, but that saying it out loud would make it real, and real things hurt more than imagined ones? He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, closing the lid with a soft click. Tonight, he decided, he would leave it there. Not forgotten. Just waiting. Waiting for the day when he would find the words. Waiting for the day when he would feel brave enough to share the parts of himself that no one else saw. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rustling the trees beyond the courtyard. A single candle flickered in its holder, casting moving shadows along the walls. And Thomas, curled beneath a thin blanket, let his eyelids grow heavy as sleep began to pull at the edges of his mind. Tonight, he would dream. Dream of home. Dream of laughter that didn't feel like armor. Dream of a world where he didn't have to wear a mask to belong. And in that dream, he would remember, even in silence, even in loneliness, he was still there. Still breathing. Still dreaming. Still human. Thomas woke to silence, not the heavy kind that pressed against his chest at night, but a soft, gentle hush that wrapped around him like a blanket still warm from the fire. The candle beside his bed had burned down to nothing, its wick now just a small curl of blackness resting in a pool of hardened wax. Outside, the sky was still dark, though the stars had begun to fade, as if even they were tired from watching over the world through the long hours of night. He lay still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. There was something peaceful about this time of day, before the castle stirred, before the servants began their morning routines, before the great hall filled with voices and laughter once more. It was a time when he could almost forget who he was supposed to be, when the weight of expectation hadn't yet returned to his shoulders. He sat up slowly, stretching his arms above his head, feeling the stiffness in his back from sleeping on the narrow mattress. He reached for the small wooden stool beside his bed and placed his feet on it, letting his body wake up at its own pace. The air in the room was cool, carrying with it the scent of stone and beeswax, familiar and comforting. Outside his window, the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear, a pale silver light creeping along the horizon, turning the darkness into something softer, less absolute. A bird called out somewhere in the distance, its song simple and unburdened, unlike the thoughts that often filled Thomas's mind. He stood and walked to the window, pressing his palms against the cool stone ledge as he looked out. The courtyard below was empty, save for a lone figure walking slowly toward the stables. The person moved with purpose, their cloak drawn tightly around them, their steps leaving faint impressions in the dew-covered grass. For a moment, Thomas envied them, whoever they were, whatever they were going to do. They seemed to belong to the morning in a way he never quite did. They didn't have to pretend, didn't have to wear a mask before the world was fully awake. He exhaled slowly and turned away from the window, reaching for his tunic. As he pulled it over his head, he felt the familiar weight of the bells stitched into his hat. They were silent now, waiting for the moment when they would ring out again, when laughter would rise and fall like waves upon the shore. But for now, there was stillness. And in that stillness, he allowed himself a few more moments of quiet, a few more breaths where he could simply be. When he stepped outside into the hallway, the castle was beginning to stir. Distant footsteps echoed along the corridors, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchens, mingling with the faint aroma of wood smoke. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, their faces already set in the expressions they wore for the day, calm, composed, unreadable. Thomas kept his head lowered as he walked, not because he felt ashamed, but because he knew what happened when people looked too closely. They saw the jester, the fool, the one who existed to make them laugh. They didn't see the boy beneath the painted face, the one who sometimes woke up feeling like he had forgotten how to smile. As he passed through the great hall, he caught sight of Roderick seated near the hearth, nursing a cup of warmed mead. Their eyes met, and Roderick gave a small nod, not a greeting exactly, but an acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that passed between those who had learned to carry their burdens without complaint. Thomas offered a faint smile in return before continuing on his way. Later that evening, after another performance, after another round of applause and scattered coins tossed at his feet, Thomas found himself standing alone beneath the archway leading into the garden. The moon had risen higher now, casting a silvery glow across the stone path, making everything seem slightly unreal, like a dream that hadn't yet decided whether to end. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there when he heard footsteps behind him. "You're quiet tonight," Marjorie said, her voice gentle as she approached. Thomas turned to look at her. "I think I've used up all my words." She smiled faintly and joined him by the archway, folding her arms across her chest as she looked up at the sky. "It's beautiful out here," she murmured. "Like the whole world is holding its breath." Thomas nodded. "Sometimes I come out here just to remember that I'm still part of it." Marjorie tilted her head slightly, steadying him. "You don't always have to be on, you know. Not even for us." He let out a soft breath. "I know. But it's hard to remember sometimes." She was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Do you ever wish things were different?" Thomas looked at her. "All the time." She nodded, as if she understood. "Me too. But wishing doesn't always change things. Sometimes, it just reminds us of what we want." Thomas thought about that. About the letter he had started writing but never finished. About the dreams he tucked away each morning before stepping into the world of laughter and performance. About the parts of himself he kept hidden, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know how else to survive. I think, he said slowly, that maybe one day, I'll find a way to be both, the jester and the boy. Maybe I can make people laugh without losing myself. Marjorie smiled. That sounds like hope. Thomas smiled faintly. Maybe it is. They stood together for a while longer, listening to the night, watching the stars blink above them. Then, as the wind shifted and carried the scent of rain in the distance, Marjorie turned to him and said softly, "Come on. Let's go inside before it starts to storm." Thomas nodded and followed her back toward the castle, the quiet of the night settling around him like a familiar friend. Because tonight, like every night, he had found a moment to breathe. A moment to remember who he was. And in that moment, he was enough. Part 5, When Laughter is a Weapon. Thomas had always believed that laughter was meant to bring joy, a gift given freely, shared between friends, passed from one generation to the next like a warm fire on a cold night. But as he grew older, as his performances became more frequent and his understanding of the court deepened, he began to see laughter in a different light. It wasn't always kind. Sometimes it was sharp, pointed, even cruel. And sometimes it could be used not just to entertain, but to expose, to challenge, to fight back in ways that words alone could not. It was during one of the midsummer feasts, a grand event held beneath the open sky, where torches flickered along the castle walls and music filled the air with a lively rhythm. The nobles were dressed in their finest silks, their laughter rising above the clinking of goblets and the scent of roasted meats. Servants moved quietly among them, refilling drinks, adjusting cushions, making sure everything remained perfect. Thomas stood at the edge of the festivities, watching as the evening unfolded. He had performed earlier, earning a round of applause and a few scattered coins tossed at his feet. Now, he was simply waiting for the next signal, ready to step forward when needed. But tonight, something felt different. A nobleman, Lord Edwin, had arrived only that morning, bringing with him a retinue of guards and an air of quiet authority. He was known throughout the region for his wealth, his cunning, and his ability to speak in riddles that often left others guessing what he truly meant. Thomas had seen him before, but never had they crossed paths directly. As the night wore on, Lord Edwin took his place at the high table, beside the king himself. He spoke with confidence, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, drawing attention wherever he turned. And when he looked toward Thomas, there was something in his gaze, not amusement exactly, but curiosity, as if he were studying a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. Then came the moment. Lord Edwin raised his goblet and called out, "And what of our fool? Does he have nothing to say tonight?" There was a ripple of laughter from those nearby, though it lacked warmth. Thomas knew better than to ignore the request. With a practiced smile, he stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Only that I am honored by your presence, my lord," he said, keeping his tone light. Lord Edwin studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Tell me, Jester, do you ever speak truths, or are all your words merely shadows of what you think we wish to hear?" The question landed like a stone in water, sending small waves through the gathered crowd. Some smiled, some glanced away, unsure whether this was part of the performance or something else entirely. Thomas hesitated only briefly before answering. Sometimes truth is easier to hear when it wears a mask. Lord Edwin's lips curled into something resembling amusement. "Clever," he said. "Very clever indeed." Then, turning to the king, he added, "Perhaps our fool has more wisdom than we give him credit for." Laughter followed, But this time, it felt different. Not mocking, not dismissive, almost respectful. And Thomas realized something in that moment. He had done something unexpected. He had taken control of the situation, not by playing the fool, but by using humor as a shield, as a way to assert himself without stepping too far out of line. Later that night, after the feast had ended and the guests had retired to their chambers, Thomas found himself walking alone through the quiet corridors of the castle. The events of the evening replayed in his mind, the way Lord Edwin had tested him, the way the crowd had listened, the way laughter had shifted from something used against him to something he could wield himself. He thought about Roderick's words, about masks, about laughter, about silence. And he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, being a jester didn't mean always being powerless. Perhaps laughter could be more than entertainment. Perhaps it could be a tool, a weapon even, used to reveal truths that others dared not speak aloud. In the weeks that followed, Thomas began to notice how often people underestimated him, how they saw only the painted face, the bells on his hat, the exaggerated expressions. They expected him to be foolish, to make mistakes, to remain forever on the edges of their world. But they didn't realize that watching from the outside gave him a perspective few others had. He saw things others missed, the way certain nobles whispered behind closed doors, the way alliances formed and dissolved with little more than a glance, the way power shifted like sand beneath their feet. And slowly, carefully, he learned how to use that knowledge. Not in rebellion. Not in defiance. But in subtle ways, in jokes that carried hidden meanings, and stories that mirrored the struggles of the court without naming names, and laughter that made people think, even if only for a moment. One evening, during a private gathering in the king's chambers, Thomas told a story about a fox who outwitted a wolf by pretending to be simple-minded. The tale was familiar, but the way he told it, the pauses, the glances, the careful emphasis on certain words, made it clear that he was speaking of more than just animals. The king laughed heartily, clapping his hands together. "Well played, fool," he declared. Others joined in, some with genuine amusement, others with knowing smiles. And Thomas, standing in the center of it all, allowed himself a small, inward victory. Because tonight, he had spoken a truth no one else dared to say. And no one had even realized it. As the night went on and the guests eventually dispersed, Thomas slipped away to his room, feeling lighter than he had in days. He sat by the window, watching the moon rise higher in the sky, its pale light casting soft shadows along the stone walls. He thought about the path ahead, about the delicate balance he would need to maintain, about the risks of pushing too far, about the fine line between cleverness and danger. But he also thought about the possibilities. What if laughter could be more than escape? What if it could be resistance? What if it could be freedom? Outside, the wind whispered gently against the glass, carrying with it the promise of another day. And inside, Thomas allowed himself a rare thing, a smile that came not from expectation, but from understanding. Because tonight, he had discovered something important. That even fools can speak truths. Sometimes, all it takes is a laugh. Thomas began to understand that laughter was not only something he gave, it was also something he could take. Not in a cruel way, not by mocking or belittling, but by using humor to reveal what others tried to hide. It was a quiet power, one that most people overlooked because they were too busy smiling to realize they had been made to see something they hadn't expected. One evening, during a gathering in the great hall, Thomas found himself standing at the edge of the room as nobles and advisors debated matters of war and diplomacy. The king sat on his high chair, listening with careful eyes as two lords argued over whether to send more men to defend a distant border village. One spoke passionately about honor and duty, while the other warned of the cost, both in coin and in lives. Thomas listened quietly, watching the way tempers rose and voices grew louder. He saw how each man tried to outshine the other, how their words became weapons sharper than any blade. And he realized that no one would stop until someone else stepped in, someone who could make them laugh before they made each other enemies. So he stepped forward. With a slow, deliberate bow, he said, "Forgive me, my lords, for interrupting such serious talk with something far less important." The lords turned toward him, some with mild amusement, others with irritation. But the king raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Go on," he said simply. Thomas smiled and continued. "I once heard a tale about two roosters who lived in the same barnyard. Each believed himself to be the rightful ruler of the morning, and neither would yield when the sun rose. They crowed louder and louder, trying to drown each other out, until one day, a fox came along and asked them a simple question: if you must fight so hard for the right to wake the world, who will be left to protect it? There was a brief pause, then a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Some of the tension in the air loosened. Even the two arguing lords exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from frustration to something closer to understanding. The king chuckled softly and leaned forward. "And what happened to the roosters?" Thomas tilted his head. They stopped crowing long enough to notice that the fox had already taken half their chickens. Laughter spread again, warmer this time, and the king waved a hand toward the lords. Perhaps there is wisdom in knowing when to speak and when to listen. The discussion resumed, but now with less heat, more reason. And Thomas, stepping back into the shadows, allowed himself a small smile. Because tonight, he had done something few others could. He had reminded powerful men that even the smallest voice could carry meaning, if only it was wrapped in laughter. In the days that followed, Thomas noticed how people began to look at him differently. Not just as a jester, not just as entertainment, but as someone who understood the game being played around him. He wasn't given a seat at the table, nor was he invited into the halls where true decisions were made. But he was listened to, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with curiosity, and occasionally with respect. Even Roderick seemed to notice the shift. "You're getting bolder," he remarked one evening as they sat together near the stables, watching the stars blink above them. Thomas looked at him. "Is that dangerous?" Roderick considered the question before answering. "It can be. Power doesn't like to be laughed at, even gently." Thomas nodded slowly. "But sometimes, laughter is the only way to say what needs to be said." Roderick studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. "You're learning quickly." Thomas didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked up at the sky, letting the silence settle between them. He thought about the stories he had told, the jokes that carried hidden meanings, the way laughter had become something more than just performance. He thought about the way people watched him now, not always with dismissal, but with interest. And he wondered how far he could go before someone decided that a fool shouldn't be allowed to speak at all. One night, after a particularly tense gathering, Thomas was walking alone through the castle corridors when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Lord Edwin approaching, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "I've been watching you," the nobleman said simply. Thomas felt his pulse quicken slightly, though he kept his face calm. "I hope I haven't disappointed you, my lord." Lord Edwin smiled faintly. "On the contrary. You amuse me more than most." Thomas bowed slightly. That is high praise, indeed. The nobleman studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Tell me, Jester, do you ever tire of playing the fool? Thomas hesitated, unsure whether this was a trap or a test. Then, carefully, he answered, only when I forget that I am not one. Lord Edwin's smile widened slightly. Clever, he murmured. Very clever. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Thomas standing alone in the hallway, feeling both relieved and unsettled. Because tonight, someone had seen him. Not just the painted face, not just the bells on his hat, but the mind beneath it all. And that was both a gift and a warning. Because in a world where truth was dangerous, laughter was a shield. But shields could be broken. And fools, no matter how clever, were still expected to know their place. Part 6, The End of the Road. Time passed like water slipping through fingers, slow in the moment, yet gone before you could hold on. Thomas had stopped counting the years since he first arrived at the castle, wide-eyed and barefoot, carrying nothing but a small bundle of belongings and a heart full of hope. But now, as he stood by his window one evening, watching the last light of day fade into deep blue, he could feel the weight of time pressing gently against his ribs. His body had changed, not dramatically, but enough for him to notice. His movements were slower, his steps less sure when he danced across the great hall. His voice still carried its playful tone, but there was a slight hoarseness to it now, a quiet reminder that even laughter had its limits. And though he still wore the same colorful tunic, the bells on his hat rang with a softer chime than they once did, perhaps because the world around him had grown quieter, or perhaps because he had simply learned to listen more closely. He had seen many things during his years at the castle. He had watched nobles rise and fall from favor, had witnessed alliances formed and broken with little more than a whispered word. He had seen children grow into adults, servants come and go, and kings pass their crowns to sons who looked too young to understand the weight they would carry. And he had seen himself change. Once, he had believed that being a jester meant simply making people laugh. That his purpose was to bring joy, to distract, to amuse. But over time, he had come to understand something deeper, that laughter was only part of the story. That beneath every performance, every joke, every exaggerated expression, there was something else, a truth that few dared to speak aloud. He had used laughter to survive, to endure, to speak when others could not. But now, as he looked out at the darkening sky, he wondered if it was time for something else. Something beyond the mask. Beyond the bells. Beyond the painted face that had become so familiar, even to himself. There were signs that the world no longer needed him the way it once did. A new boy had arrived at the castle, younger, quicker, with a voice that rang out like music and eyes that sparkled with mischief. The nobles laughed at him easily, eagerly, drawn to his energy the way moths were drawn to flame. Thomas watched from the shadows as the boy performed, twisting his body into wild shapes, telling stories with such enthusiasm that even the most serious lords found themselves smiling. He felt no jealousy, only a quiet understanding. This was how it always ended. A new fool would rise. An old one would fade. It was the natural order of things. One evening, after a long night of performances, Thomas found himself sitting alone near the stables, letting the cool night air settle around him. Roderick joined him a few moments later, holding 2 small cups filled with warm mead. "You look tired," Roderick said, handing him one of the cups. Thomas smiled faintly and took a sip. "I suppose I am." Roderick studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You've been here a long time." Thomas nodded. "Longer than I ever expected." "And now?" Roderick asked quietly. "What comes next?" Thomas looked down at his hands, tracing invisible lines along the wooden cup's rim. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent so many years trying to be what others wanted. I'm not sure what I want anymore." Roderick leaned back against the stable wall, staring up at the stars. "Sometimes, finding yourself takes longer than we expect." Thomas let the words settle inside him. He thought about home, not just the place, but the feeling. The scent of hay in the barn, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the sound of his mother's voice calling him in for supper. He hadn't returned in years, hadn't sent letters, hadn't even spoken of it much. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when the castle grew still and the wind whispered through the trees, he could almost hear the fields calling his name. "I think," he said slowly, "that maybe it's time to remember who I was before all this." Roderick gave him a knowing smile. "Then maybe it's time to leave." Thomas didn't answer right away. He simply stared into the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the castle settling into sleep. He thought about everything he had built here, the friendships, the lessons, the moments where laughter had been more than just performance. He thought about Marjorie, about the kindness she had shown him, the way she had seen him even when no one else did. And he thought about the future. Not the one he had imagined as a boy, filled with grandeur and applause. But a different kind of future. One where he could walk without bells ringing at his feet. Where he could speak without needing to twist his words into jokes. Where he could simply be. "I think you're right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Roderick nodded, as if he had known this moment would come all along. They sat together for a while longer, sipping their drinks in silence, letting the night wrap around them like an old blanket. Then, as the wind shifted and carried the scent of rain in the distance, Roderick nudged Thomas lightly with his elbow. "Come on," he said. "Let's go inside before it starts to storm." Thomas nodded and followed him back toward the castle, the quiet hum of candlelight guiding their way. Because tonight, like every night, was just another step forward. Toward something new. Toward something unknown. Toward something real. The morning after that quiet night beneath the stars, Thomas stood at the edge of the castle courtyard, watching as a group of servants prepared for the day's tasks. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. A rooster crowed from somewhere beyond the walls, and the sky above was painted in soft hues of gold and pink, the kind of sunrise that felt like both an ending and a beginning. He had made his decision. It hadn't come suddenly, nor had it arrived with drama or grand gestures. It had grown quietly, like ivy creeping along stone, until one day he simply knew it was time to leave. And so, with slow but steady steps, he made his way toward the great hall, where the king would soon take his place among nobles and advisors. He passed beneath archways carved with stories he could now read, walked across floors worn smooth by years of footsteps, and listened to the familiar sounds of the castle waking up around him. When he reached the hall, he waited patiently near the entrance, unnoticed by most. But eventually, the king's steward spotted him and nodded in recognition. "The king wishes to see you," the man said simply. Thomas followed him inside, past rows of long wooden tables and banners hanging heavy with age. The king sat on his high chair, already dressed in fine robes, his expression unreadable as Thomas approached. "You've been with us a long time," the king said before Thomas could bow. Thomas inclined his head. Yes, your grace. And yet I sense something has changed. Thomas hesitated only briefly before answering. I have lived many years in this castle, served many meals with laughter, and brought joy when silence threatened to settle too deeply. But now, I believe it is time for me to remember who I was before I became your fool. The king studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. You were never just a fool, Thomas. Thomas bowed slightly. Thank you, my lord. There was no anger in the king's eyes, no disappointment. Only understanding. And after a pause, he spoke again. If you wish to leave, then you may go freely. You have earned that right. Thomas exhaled softly, feeling something lift from his chest, not sadness, not regret, but relief. Thank you, he said again. The king waved a hand dismissively. Go with peace. And if ever you wish to return, know that this place will remember you. With that, the conversation ended. Thomas stepped back, bowed once more, and turned to leave. As he walked through the corridors one last time, he noticed how different everything looked, not because anything had changed, but because he had. The castle remained as it always had, grand, imposing, filled with whispers behind closed doors. But he no longer needed to be part of it. He had spent years learning how to survive within its walls, how to speak truths wrapped in humor, how to find meaning even when the world saw him only as entertainment. Now, he would learn how to live without those masks. How to speak without needing to make people laugh first. How to be seen for who he truly was. Outside, the world stretched wide before him, fields of green rolling into the distance, roads winding toward places unknown. He carried little with him, a small bundle of belongings, a few coins gifted by friends, and the memories of all he had seen and done. Marjorie met him near the gates, her eyes soft with understanding. I knew this day would come, she said gently. Thomas smiled. So did I. I just didn't know when. She handed him a small cloth-wrapped package. For the road, she said. Don't open it until you're far enough away that the bells won't follow you. He chuckled lightly, accepting the gift with gratitude. Thank you, Marjorie. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. You'll be missed. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. I hope so. Then, with one last glance at the castle that had been his home for so many years, he stepped forward and began walking. The path ahead was uncertain. There were no guarantees waiting beyond the hills. No promises hidden in the wind. But there was something else, something quieter, deeper. Freedom. Not the kind that came with riches or titles, but the kind that came with choice. The kind that allowed him to decide what came next, without needing to perform for anyone else. As he walked, the sun rose higher in the sky, casting warm light across the fields. Birds sang overhead, their songs simple and unburdened. The air smelled of fresh grass and earth, and with every step, Thomas felt lighter. He thought about Roderick's words, about masks, about laughter, about silence. He thought about the lessons he had learned, the truths he had spoken in jest, the moments when he had found joy even in the smallest things. And he thought about what came next. Would he return to his village? Would he travel to new places, meet new people, start again? He didn't know. And for the first time in a long while, that was okay. Because now, he had the freedom to choose. To dream. To be. And as the wind whispered gently against his skin, carrying with it the promise of something new, Thomas smiled, not for an audience, not for expectation, but simply because he could. Because today, he was no longer someone's fool. Today, he was simply himself. And that was enough. Part 7, The Legacy of a Fool. Years passed like leaves drifting down from autumn trees, quiet, steady, and impossible to hold on to for long. The castle remained where it had always been, its stone walls withered by time but standing firm against the sky. Life within its halls continued much as it always had. Nobles came and went, new jesters took their places upon the stage, and laughter still echoed through the great hall during feasts and festivals. But Thomas was no longer there. Instead, he lived in a small village nestled between rolling hills and fields that stretched toward the horizon like an endless sea of green. It was not the village of his childhood. Too many years had passed for him to return exactly where he began, but it was close enough in spirit. The people here were simple, kind, and unburdened by the weight of courtly expectations. They rose with the sun, worked with their hands, and gathered around fires at night to share stories passed down through generations. Thomas had found peace here. Not the kind that came suddenly or dramatically, but the kind that grew slowly, like roots finding soil after a long journey. He had traded his colorful tunic for plain woolen clothes, his bells for silence, and his painted face for something quieter, something more honest. He still told stories, though now they were different. Not for nobles, not for kings, not even for applause. But for children who sat wide-eyed by the fire, for elders who nodded knowingly as they listened, for travelers who stopped by the village and asked if anyone had tales worth telling. And sometimes, when the wind whispered through the trees or the stars blinked above like tiny lanterns, he would remember the life he once lived, the laughter that filled grand halls, the way torchlight flickered across polished stone floors, the sound of bells ringing softly with every step he took. He remembered Roderick. Remembered Marjorie. Remembered the nights when silence felt heavier than stone, and the days when laughter was both armor and weapon. And most of all, he remembered himself, not just as the jester, not just as the fool who made others smile, but as the boy who had once stood at the edge of a world he barely understood, wondering if he would ever find his place. Now, he knew. He had found it not in the castle, not in the laughter of strangers, but in the quiet moments between stories, in the warmth of shared bread and warm cider, in the gentle rhythm of a life that did not demand performance. One evening, as the last light of day faded into deep blue, Thomas sat beside a fire in the village square, surrounded by children whose eyes shone with curiosity. A young girl, no older than 7, looked up at him and asked, "Did you really used to be a jester?" He smiled gently and nodded. "A long time ago." The girl leaned forward eagerly. "What was it like?" Thomas looked into the fire, letting the memory settle inside him before answering. "It was strange," he said slowly. "Strange because I was seen by so many, but rarely known. Strange because I could make people laugh without them ever knowing what I truly felt. And strange because, even though I wore a mask, I learned more about myself than I ever expected." The children listened intently, some nodding, others simply watching him with wide eyes. "I didn't go to the castle because I wanted power," he continued. "I went because I needed a place to belong. And for a time, I did. I found friends. I found meaning. I found ways to speak truths that others could not say aloud." He paused, then added softly, "But eventually, I realized that belonging doesn't always mean staying." The girl tilted her head. "So why did you leave?" Thomas looked at her for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes, the bravest thing is not to stay where you are known, but to leave and discover who you are when no one is watching. The children were quiet for a while, letting his words settle like embers glowing in the dark. Then another child, a boy this time, asked, "Do you miss it? The castle, the laughter, the bells?" Thomas thought about that. He missed the music that played in the great hall, the scent of spiced wine on feast nights, the way candlelight danced along stone walls. He missed the thrill of a well-timed joke, the way a clever twist of words could turn a room full of strangers into a chorus of laughter. But more than anything, he missed the feeling of being seen, even if only for a moment, even if only through the lens of entertainment. Still, he answered honestly. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes I do. But I don't miss needing to wear a mask to feel like I belonged." The children nodded, as if they understood. Later that night, after the fire had burned low and the children had gone to bed, Thomas walked alone beneath the stars. The air was cool, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant rain. He followed a familiar path toward the edge of the village, where an old wooden bench sat beneath a tree whose branches reached toward the sky like fingers trying to touch the stars. He sat down, resting his hands on his knees, and looked up. Somewhere far away, beyond the hills and forests, the castle still stood. And somewhere inside it, another jester was making people laugh tonight. Another fool was wearing bells, painting his face, twisting his expressions to amuse those who watched. And perhaps, like Thomas once had, that jester was learning how to use laughter not just to entertain, but to survive. To speak. To endure. To be. Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of memory settle around him like a familiar blanket. He hoped that whoever wore the mask now would find their own path and their own time. That they would learn that laughter could be more than escape. That they would understand that even fools could carry wisdom. That they would one day find the courage to take off the mask, not because they had to, but because they finally knew who they were beneath it. Because that was the real journey. Not the laughter. Not the bells. Not the painted face, but the quiet truth that waited patiently in the spaces between performances. And as Thomas sat beneath the stars, listening to the wind whisper through the trees, he smiled, not for an audience, not for expectation, not even for memory, but simply because he could. Because tonight, like every night, he was free. And that was enough. As the seasons passed, Thomas's presence in the village became as familiar as the wind that swept across the hills or the rhythm of the church bell marking the hours. He no longer wore bells on his hat. He had long since given them away to a traveling musician who had stopped by one spring, but something of the jester still lived within him. It wasn't in his clothes or his expressions, but in the way he spoke, in the gentle humor with which he told stories, and in the quiet wisdom hidden beneath every word. Children still gathered around him at dusk, eager for tales of distant lands, of kings and queens, of laughter that hid sorrow, and of masks worn not just for performance, but for survival. He never exaggerated the grandeur of the castle, nor did he speak of it with bitterness. Instead, he described it like a dream remembered in fragments, vivid in parts, hazy in others, always shifting with time. One evening, as autumn leaves fell gently around the village square, an older boy, perhaps 13 or 14, sat beside Thomas on the wooden bench where they often shared stories. The boy was quiet for a while before speaking. "I heard you used to be a jester," he said, looking out over the fields where golden light stretched across the land. Thomas smiled faintly. "A long time ago." The boy hesitated, then asked, "Was it lonely?" Thomas looked at him carefully, noting the curiosity behind his eyes, not just about the life of a court jester, but about something deeper. Something personal. Yes, he answered after a moment. Sometimes it was. The boy nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something unspoken. Thomas turned to face him more fully. Why do you ask? The boy shifted slightly, tugging at the hem of his coat. I think I know what it feels like. To smile when you don't feel like it. To make people laugh so they don't notice what's really going on inside. Thomas felt something stir within him, not sadness, not pity, but understanding. He leaned back against the bench, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. You know, he said gently, there's nothing wrong with wanting to make people happy. There's nothing wrong with being funny, or clever, or charming. But there's also nothing wrong with letting yourself feel what you truly feel, even if no one else understands it. The boy looked at him, eyes wide with something between relief and wonder. Thomas continued, being a jester taught me many things. One of the most important was this: laughter can be a gift, but it shouldn't be a prison. You should never have to hide who you are just to keep others smiling. The boy was quiet for a long time before nodding. Thank you, he whispered. Thomas gave him a small smile. Anytime. That night, as Thomas walked home through the quiet village streets, he thought about how strange life could be. He had spent years trying to find meaning in laughter, only to realize later that the real meaning came from knowing when to stop pretending. And now, years later, he found himself passing that lesson on, not in lectures or speeches, but in quiet moments like this, where someone listened and understood. Over time, Thomas began writing down the stories he once told by firelight. Not all of them, only the ones that carried something true, something worth remembering. He filled pages with tales of jesters who spoke truths in riddles, of nobles who learned humility through laughter, of fools who were wiser than those who watched them perform. Some nights, he read these stories aloud to the villagers, especially during the cold winter months when the fires burned longer and the nights stretched endlessly before them. Other nights, he simply wrote, letting the scratch of ink against parchment fill the silence of his small home. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right and the stars blinked above like tiny lanterns, he would imagine that somewhere far away, another jester was reading his words, not because they made him laugh, but because they reminded him that he was not alone. Because that was the true legacy of a fool. Not the laughter. Not the bells. Not the painted face. But the ability to remind others, even long after they had left the stage, that behind every joke, every twist of words, every exaggerated expression, there was something human. Something real. Something worth remembering. Years passed, and the world changed. Kings came and went. New jesters took their places in castles across the land. Some brought joy. Some brought wisdom. Some simply survived. And in a quiet village nestled between rolling hills, a man who had once worn bells on his hat continued to tell stories, not for nobles, not for coin, but for those who needed to hear them. Because some legacies were not built in palaces. They were built in quiet corners, in whispered words, in the spaces between laughter. And sometimes, they lasted longer than any crown. And so, dear listener, our journey with Thomas comes to an end, or perhaps, it simply continues in a different way. Because even though his story has reached its final chapter, the echoes of his laughter, his struggles, and his quiet wisdom still linger, like the last notes of a lullaby drifting through a sleepy room. If you've made it this far, whether fully awake or already slipping into dreams, thank you for walking beside him, and beside me, for these quiet hours. Thank you for allowing yourself to be carried by words instead of worries, by stories instead of thoughts that won't let go. Thomas's life was not one of grand battles or sweeping romances. It was not filled with riches or royal titles. But it was filled with something just as important: honesty, resilience, and the quiet courage to know when to stay and when to leave. Because sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is stop pretending to be someone we're not, and simply allow ourselves to be who we are. If there's one thing Thomas taught us, it's that laughter doesn't always mean joy. Sometimes, it means survival. Sometimes, it means hiding. And sometimes, it means speaking truths no one else dares to say, wrapped in humor, softened by sound, carried gently on the wind. And maybe, just maybe, that's what storytelling is too. A way to make sense of the world. A way to feel less alone. A way to fall asleep knowing that somewhere, someone understood exactly how you felt, even if they never met you. Right now, you can simply rest. Let your mind soften. Let your body relax. Let your heart slow down. And if you'd like, you can imagine yourself walking beside Thomas one last time, through fields bathed in moonlight, beneath skies painted with stars, toward a place where peace isn't something you chase, but something you simply find. And may you always remember, you are not alone. Good night.